Okay, welcome back. It's Dr. Gene Mesco, and we're going to eat the rich today. Only a figurative saying, because I bet you a lot of them are pretty fatty. No, it's an old phrase from the French Revolution, but just reminding everybody as our political season is moving along, we had the big announcement this week of Joe Biden dropping out of the race here in America, and Kamala Harris stepping up, being handed the nomination. And it should be a fun race between the orange felon, the parasite, against the former prosecutor. We'll have to see how that plays out. But it fits nicely into the narrative that I've been working on, that here in America, we've got the problem of capitalism versus democracy. Those are our evolving social adaptations. And once again, we've chosen this party action, this separation of powers, populace, and we've got people who want to just hold on to an older way of thinking about things when the white guy should be in charge, which I think historically extends all the way back through hundreds, centuries of colonialism, hundreds of years, where we've gone back in time. And we had this situation where European powers, royalty, had taken ownership of everything. What used to be military power based on landed aristocracy morphed through the hundreds of years of the Industrial Revolution when we built up our global civilization. As we've built this global civilization, what we've ended up with is a new aristocracy, an economic aristocracy, that was anchored in white guys in Europe because they were the guys who were in power. There was those familial connections initially, which built up the royals in Europe over centuries. And then the scientific revolution gave them the technology to navigate the world and develop weapons that they originally turned on each other. And then they realized, oh, wait a minute, we can go out and take over all these other places and use their resources and take their land, and we can farm out the poor white people and take over. And that's the American dream came about based on just a historical accident. We hit America, Columbus found it, and it hadn't been fully filled up. Humans evolved coming out of Africa, filled up most of Africa and Asia and Europe, and it built up our own cultures in different parts of the planet and spread all over the place. But the most recent human conquest had been the Americas. From a biological standpoint, it was only 20,000 years ago, as opposed to hundreds of thousands of years ago that we expanded out of Africa. But those 20,000-year-old civilizations that migrated through the Americas weren't able to build up as much tech. They didn't have as much time sitting in one place. We could talk about the evolution of science and tech on another point, but that aristocratic hierarchy that evolved in Europe when you combine the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution gave those European monarchs the ability, the tools to conquer the planet. And that's where we were 100 years ago, when people said, well, wait a minute, we don't want those people in charge. We're going to take them out. And that's what the wars of the 20th century were all about. It was democracy versus aristocrats. And we got tricked in the 80s when communism fell. And people said, all right, well, we want an economy that works. We don't want this centralized economy. People still thought they wanted democracy. But democracy's messy. Democracy is this problem that comes about when you say everybody should have a say in government. And when you do that, it gets messy, it's inefficient. And having an autocrat, having somebody who's just in charge who owns everything, like a king, was more efficient. But we didn't want that anymore, so we were conflicted there for quite a while. Now, we were riding a high after after we won, after the Western nations knocked down communism, because they spoke about democracy as well, but they slipped back into the old autocratic rule. And we've done sort of the same here in the West. We've said, well, wait a minute, shouldn't there just be somebody in charge? Can't somebody make a decision? And that worked in terms of pushing capitalism as long as we had enough resources to go around. And the biggest resource was energy, of course. We ran into that oil embargo, so we've had this conflict with the Middle East for years trying to figure out oil, but we're about to be hung on our own petard, as I believe the Bard said, whatever a petard is. And when we get that going, what we realize is that we still need energy. We're still confronted with the biological realities, because that's always part of the equation. So we have this marvelous civilization that we're trying to sort out. As I've said, it originally was just biological. Then we evolved consciousness, and we figured out how to think about stuff. And we did our hunter-gatherer thing. And then thousands of years ago, we started to build civilizations. And if you look back through the historical record, what was there primarily for thousands of years were empires, monarchies. We put a king in charge. Sometimes it was with priests. You gotta have a good religion to go with a good monarchy, because you gotta have a belief system. Because bottom line is, nobody has all the answers. Because nobody has all the answers, we gotta make stuff up. And that's what we do with belief systems. We create gods, and we say, hey, here's some really good rules. And the really good rules get filtered through selection. That's the beautiful process of evolution. Variations are generated for information storage. And we use information to fight off entropy. And we stay organized. For millions and billions of years, it was DNA information. It was just biological information, just natural selection. But when consciousness evolved, 50, 100,000 years ago, humans were able to think and generate mental information. And when we had that mental information, we said, how are we going to organize our societies? Well, when there were only a few of us, we could talk about it. We could do democracy. And that's probably what we had for hunter-gatherers. And then, as we got bigger and bigger and got more successful, built bigger societies, we found out having just a few people in charge was more efficient. And that's how we got autocrats. That's how we got monarchies and priesthoods. And they sorted out the ideas and regulated the economy and fought off the invaders. And things worked to varying success at different points. And we built those up in different parts of the planet, and people migrated. And eventually we filled up the planet. And as we were filling up the planet, we had that beautiful invention of science and tech that fueled the Industrial Revolution, that ignited the sparks of democracy too, because we said, well, wait a minute, we don't all have to work in the fields, we don't all have to grind out a life and worry about invaders all the time. Maybe we could just get along. And that played itself out through hundreds of years of colonialism, and then the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and then the mishmash that was the 20th century, where we threw monarchies up against democracies, and we said, not doing it. We're going to end democracies won. But then we still had to work out the economy, and that was the Cold War that we talked about. And the Cold War boiled down to centralized economies versus free market economies. And that's the idea of Western capitalism versus those centralized economies, which didn't work for Russia and China, so they became capitalist as well. But here's the problem. And what popped up in the East, in Russia and China, was basically crony capitalism. That's one you can look up. Crony capitalism involves saying, well, only a few people have ownership. And that's where we get to today's topic. That's where we get to eat the rich. Because here's the challenge that we face as we move through the 21st century. We've always had a hierarchical society as far as anybody can remember. We've always had people in charge, people who had more resources, more power. It was political power, it was economic power, it was religious power because they got put on top of belief systems. And they've made the rules, and most of us got along. We dealt with whatever hand we played with whatever hand we were dealt, and then we were dealing with problems. But in America, we didn't have to deal with them as much because we had frontiers, we had wilderness. We were able to just walk away, literally walk away from the problems and say, I'm going to cross this boundary and form a new state, build a new town, stake out my own homestead. And that worked for a couple of centuries as we filled up the continent. And then we went to war, getting rid of the old autocrats. We reluctantly went into World War I and World War II. We were dragging our feet on that. The old world was fighting it out. All those monarchies were getting beat up. And we finally got drawn into the fray because we had to be. We filled up the planet, and humans as a species have built this marvelous global economy, this global civilization. But what we don't have is a functional world government. We have the UN, which is marvelously dysfunctional. But how could we make a functional world government? And we've got three major social adaptations that we use to build our civilizations. We have economies, which allow us to distribute resources. We have governments, which make the rules. And we have belief systems to make up the information to figure out what the rules should be and how we should organize our markets and our economies. And that's been, for the most part, that's been religions. But if you've been listening to me, my take on this is that we should all adopt a new belief system, a relatively new belief system, the one that's only a few centuries old that we call science. Because when you start with science, you don't need gods. You say, well, wait a minute, there may be a God out there. We can't prove it. You can't prove it either. But let's start with the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis for science says there probably isn't a God, as far as we can tell. Gods are made up by humans. We've had thousands of them over the years. We show evidence of all sorts of gods and pantheons popping up over the millennia. And what are we left with? We're left with this idea that somebody has to have some rules. Well, what if the rules are that we're all human, that we're all the same species, and that biology is a reasonable explanation of life on Earth? And when you look at it that way, we say, oh, there's limited resources. People live and die. And we should make rules that optimize that. At the very least, we should figure out how to all live together. And that generates now our new ethical code, which says, oh, well, if nobody has all the answers, if there aren't any gods, then the rules should be based on what's the best for the most people. That leads us to democracy as the best form of government. Churchill said it was the worst form of government except for all the others. Because if somebody else is in charge, eventually you're going to get tired. Eventually you're going to disagree with them. And if you disagree with them, then we're going to fight. Then we're going to waste resources. We're going to kill each other. We're going to do all those nasty things. And that's what we're still doing. We've been doing it for frickin' millennia. How do we get past it? Well, if we agree and we have to include everybody, then the only issue becomes, what's the main thing we're arguing about? The main thing we're arguing about is how do we distribute resources? And the rich people like us to argue about it. Because the rich people, what we have throughout most of the planet, are resources that have been sucked up by a handful of wealthy people. They're the leftover aristocrats. We still have some of the monarchs sucking onto stuff. But we've also built up these economic aristocrats because the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution were so successful at generating economic growth and new products. A lot of people were able, well, a handful of people were able to climb to the top of those economic pyramids and grab onto a bunch of resources. And because they had that economic power, they were able to help choose how the rules were made. And that's what we're arguing about today. We've got rules that are made by economics, we've got rules that are made by religions, we've got rules that are made by governments, but we also have rules that we've generated from science. And the ones from science say, hey, resources are limited. You need a certain amount of energy. You need nutrients to stay alive. Everybody should have some space to work with. And if we really want to optimize human development and be all we can be as a species, maybe we should go explore the outer worlds. Maybe we should get off planet. Maybe we should turn our world into a garden space. Maybe we should figure out how to manage the ecosystems that we all have to live in. Because right now we're headed down a path where we've had this brief spurt of freedom. A few hundred years with the new wilderness in America that said, oh, I can have my own space. I can grow my own crops. I can live on my farm here. I can trade with other people and I can have my own castle. I can be my own aristocrat. Oh, that would be great if we had unlimited resources, which we don't. And so the reality of the situation is we have to figure out how to share. And the only way to share reasonably is through democracy, is giving everybody a say. That's why we have these arguments now. That's why we have people like Putin and the guy in Turkey, or frick, I forget his name. But we got the orange parasite here in America and his cohort, and they say we've got mine, we've got ours. Fuck you to the rest of the world. We're going to hold on to it, and that's the basic problem. And that's why we have to eat the rich. What we have to do is say, no, capitalism is really great. People should, we want competition. Evolution says you cooperate and compete for resources and you find the best balance. And right now we've got an imbalance because we kill each other. We don't have enough resources to go around. We don't have enough space. We don't distribute our resources evenly enough. And a lot of people feel they're getting shortchanged, which is where all the anger management comes from. So how do we get past all that? Well, we say we make the rules so that everybody has a chance, an opportunity. And we set up our economy in a really basic way. And this is where we get to eat the rich. We just say, hey, just like there's limits in the natural world, and there's limits on lifespan, and there's limits on resources, we're going to put limits on the economy. And we're going to put limits on the economy that say, you can only own so much stuff. As an arbitrary number, we have to play with this with the democratic process, but I think 10 billion is a nice number to start with. Does anybody really need more than $10 million a year? Think about that. Most of us are never going to see $10 million. The estimate right now, the average income in the U.S. is household income is a little north of $60,000 a year. You work for 40, 50 years, you will earn over $1 million in one lifetime. And that's the average, which should be a nice middle-class lifestyle. What would that entail? A nice middle-class lifestyle would say, oh, I've got my own home, I get to take a vacation, I have some decent health care, I get a retirement, and I could raise my family, and I could go into retirement and play shuffleboard or whatever hobby you wish to pick up, and have a reasonable life. That's what most people would like to have. But guess what? Fewer and fewer of us are going to have that as resources get used up, and as the freaking climate changes, and we run out of energy. We've already passed a point that the geologists call peak oil. Because in case you haven't noticed, the oil companies have a fair amount of economic power. Everybody wants energy. And most of it comes from fossil fuel these days, and that's the whole climate change problem. And if you don't believe that's real, then go read a book. Go frickin' figure it out. Ask some serious questions and get some serious answers, because it's a real thing. We're altering the climate. Things are going to change. We're going to lose some coastal lands. We're going to have weirder weather, which is going to make crops more expensive, farming more expensive, which is going to drive up food prices, and the economy is going to get a little crappier for a while until we figure out how to solve this problem. And guess what? The rich people don't give a shit. Because if you're rich, if you have excessive wealth, you'll always be able to corner the market on something. You'll be able to hoard some resources, and you and yours will be okay. And if you're sitting on top of the economic pyramids, isolating yourself on your mansions, on your estates, you don't really care, because you think in the long term, you'll be okay. And if more people suffer and more people die, that's the price of the playing the game, of having this marvelous thing we call capitalism in a free society. And that's how it works. Well, as more and more people get squeezed and pinched out of the economic game, can we come up with a better solution? And here's mine. We go about saying democracy is better than capitalism. The people are more important than money. Money is just a tool we've created. And ultimately, life is about staying alive and having a good life. And what's good in life, that's for each of us to choose. That's what belief systems are about. But if we all share science, then we'd say, well, life at the very least should be about staying alive and reproducing and keeping the species alive. And by extension, it should be about keeping all these other species alive, which basically goes back to managing the earth. So we should base our society primarily on human well-being and environmental prosperity. If we focused on that and just said, how do we build healthy ecosystems? How do we maintain the ecosystems that have evolved? How do we direct their evolution with our brilliant intellects, our consciousness that's evolved, that gives us the ability to think and solve problems? How do we go about doing that? Well, we need to organize ourselves into democratic units that say, we're going to take care of this part of the planet. Because that's the problem with the rich. When you have people who have so much money that they have so much control, they get bored. We all get bored. And they play games with us. They go and build things in other parts of the world. They build growth factories to build new crap to sell to people. And they chew up resources and they blow up the environment and they generate conflict because they're squeezing every last dime out of their workers so that they can have excess. And all I'm saying is there's a really easy answer. You put a cap on capitalism. You say capitalism is subservient to democracy, and nobody gets to make rules all by themselves, which is what rich people get to do now. They get to spend literally billions of dollars on politicians, and they get to influence the rules. And we should all step back and say, no, that's ridiculous. And we should separate the economy into two sectors, because we argue about, oh, that's a socialist economy. Well, it's just a matter of what part of the economy do we regulate. We all say there has to be some regulation of markets. Money doesn't mean anything if we revert to just force. That's the problem with violence, because that's why if you look at the sides of the politics in America right now, and you talk about the red hatters, the right, the Republicans, the whatever you want to call it, versus the left, the blue, the progressive, whatever you say, it's democracy versus capitalism at a fundamental level. And that's why the religious and the violence is more associated on the right than on the left. There's some of both on each, obviously. But the big issue is if I'm promoting the organization of society from primarily a capitalist perspective, which is what the orange parasite does. The orange parasite says, along with all of his followers, oh, we've got ours, fuck you, we should just take care of our own. That eventually is just going to breed conflict because we're using in excess. You have to acknowledge that our consumption is greedy. We drive big trucks and we've taken over land. That's great. But guess what? We can either fight or we can share. And if we want to share, then we have to figure out how to share equally. Well, we should share so that everybody we increase the middle. In evolution, we would call this stabilizing selection. We minimize the extremes. We try to minimize poverty, and we try to minimize excessive wealth. That's what we haven't done. See, for what we've done socially for years, we've said the right has just said, no. If we let people build more economies and make more money, they'll share it, they'll spread it around. And we all know that's bullshit. That was classic Reaganomics, the trickle-down hypothesis, which I think was most accurately described metaphorically as most of us get pissed on. And if you just say, well, wait a minute, let's cap the top end. while we're trying to push up from the bottom. So we minimize poverty and we build a bigger middle class. Then we can argue about abortion and drugs and all those stupid things that we argue about. Because bottom line is, life and death should be left up to the families. Life and death is a biological phenomenon. In terms of evolution, it boils down to which genes, which alleles, which forms of the genes get to persist. And that's a choice for every family to make. They should take care of their babies. Every family should take care of its elders. And that should be left up to the biological level. The economy should be regulated at the government level by democratic votes, real democracy, where everybody, as many people as who are competent adults get a say. And we get to say, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cap wealth. Anything over $10 million gets taxed. You don't need, why do you need more than $10 million? If you need more than $10 million, you get to go into the worst ghetto in your neighborhood, in your country, in America right now, and you have to explain to those people why you're worth more than $10 million, and they should have to fucking fight and scrape to get by. Why they have to compete for housing and food and medical care while you're fucking flying in spaceships and taking tourism to the moon and living on ridiculous amounts of wealth. And I think you could be okay. Anybody could be okay, I think, with $10 million. That's just a starting point. We should have it. If I'm better than you, we want competition. But we want reasonable competition. We don't want competition that involves people eventually going to war and killing each other, where people make money off of these huge weapon systems that kill each other. It's ridiculous how we piss away our resources. And we do it because rich people get to make decisions now. We got rid of the old landed aristocracy, the old royalty. But all we've done is allowed capitalism to take its place. And we've allowed people to climb up to these pyramids and they get to spend their money and they say it's freedom. Look up Citizens United versus the FEC if you want the supreme decisions that have supported this. And we need to say, no, there's a cap on this. We need to limit how much anybody should have. And then we should build two subsets of the economy. We should distinguish wants from needs. Housing, school, healthcare, food should all be regulated economies. That's the only stuff the government should regulate and say, what does everybody need? We want everybody to have a home. We want everybody to have decent healthcare. We want everybody to have an opportunity for education. All the other stuff, all the recreational stuff, assuming you're not polluting the environment, gets to do whatever you want. Well, free up the drugs. Free up all the other stuff. Let people make choices, and it'll sort itself out. Evolution will find a way to sort it out and make the best answers. And if you optimize selection while optimizing development, because that's what we would do with this system, we would say every human has the chance to grow up in a healthy, safe environment. And then we could all ask questions. And we'd find the best answers. And you free up the other side of the economy and say, yeah, you want recreational stuff? Sure, have fun. Get rid of all the rules about down where I live. They have blue laws based on religion. Now, free up all that stuff. And just say, what do we need to do to build a better world? We need to stabilize the economy and the environment so that every human can develop to be a functional adult. And if we were all reasonable, functional adults, then we could talk about the problems and make decisions based on democracy. And in order to do that, we got to eat the rich. Sorry. Not just the uber rich, not the really rich. We don't want to kill incentives. We want that. But let's get rid of the ridiculousness at the top of the scale, just like we try to get rid of the poverty at the bottom end of the scale. A little stabilizing selection would go a long way. That's all I've got for today. Talk to you guys again.